Hi and welcome. It's election time in Sweden. On September the 9th, the Swedes will vote in parliamentary and local elections. This includes Swedes living abroad. These elections will be quite interesting. Sweden is going through very significant changes. Changes in its demography and the culture and then overall in the society. This is also reflected in the politics. Traditionally, you had the Social Democrats and the Moderate Party, which is a conservative party, or at least it pretends to be. You had these two parties, which dominated the political scene in Sweden for most of its democratic history. But recently, there has been a lot of turmoil on the political scene. The Social Democrats, as well as the Moderate Party, have been losing voters. And the other smaller parties, like the Center Party or the Liberal Party, have also been losing ground. There's only one exception, the Communist Leftist Party. They have in fact been gaining ground. And this is the most radical of all the parties in Sweden. And that is perhaps the biggest change in Swedish politics. The political scene is becoming more and more polarized. On the left, we see people abandoning the traditional Social Democratic Party, and instead, we see people choosing the more radical Communist or Leftist Party. And on the right, we have a new party, or relatively new party, which is called the Sweden Democrats. And it has been gaining ground year after year. And right now, they stand a good chance of actually becoming the biggest party in Sweden. Now, this doesn't mean that they will be able to form government because it's unlikely that they will get over 50% of the seats in parliament. But in any case, it's still a very significant shift that is taking place. All of the other mainstream parties have basically vowed that they will do everything they can to exclude the Sweden Democrats. And the Sweden Democrats, they're not really that conservative. They are pro gay rights, pro feminism, pro all of these Swedish values that we can hear about in television. They are for the Swedish welfare state. They're a little bit more against migrants than the rest of the parties, but they are not by any means a radical party. And yet, in the mainstream media, they are portrayed as being an incredibly racist far right party. That has, of course, nothing to do with the truth. So, unless they get 50% of the vote, it's unlikely that they will form government in Sweden. There is also one other very new party in Sweden, which is called the Alternative for Sweden, or the AFS. I guess they were inspired by the Alternative for Germany. It is more to the right than the Sweden Democrats. Of course, it's accused of all the usual nonsense, being far right, racist, and xenophobic, words which today have become weapons of oppressive regimes. These words mean in reality nothing anymore. The AFS has taken a more hardline stance on immigration. They want migrants to return to their home countries, which is a perfectly reasonable argument. That should be, in fact, the goal of every country's immigration policy. It is also the most humane solution. People who have been forced to flee their homes because of wars should be given safe refuge, preferably in a neighboring country, and once the war is over, they should be given the opportunity to return. The help from the international community should be focused on ending the war and the rebuilding process. What better way to help refugees is there than giving them the opportunity to return to their homes and rebuilding what was destroyed? The policies put forward by the AFS are surprisingly reasonable, something rarely seen in Swedish politics. They want a school which sets clear standards that need to be met. Instead of NATO, they want a strong Swedish defense, banning censorship, an emphasis on traditional Swedish values, and a return to classical architecture. The last point is perhaps the most interesting. Marxism has corrupted all aspects of our societies: politics, the economy, film and music, our culture, human relations, and also the architecture. It would be a great thing to see Le Corbusier's nightmare of socio-realistic architecture be laid to the ground and in its place see the rise of a beautiful classical architecture. If the alternative for Sweden is speaking about getting rid of the ugly communist-style architecture, then they are quite aware of what's going on, much more so than the Sweden Democrats, who have drifted towards the mainstream, unfortunately. The Sweden Democrats have in fact been criticizing the AFS. The Sweden Democrats are starting to act like the other mainstream parties, when in fact these two parties should be cooperating. And I think that if in the future there's a situation in Parliament where they have the opportunity to form a government, I think they will put their differences aside and actually do what's right and start cooperating. When you see what's going on in Sweden today, it's just incredible. The country has changed so much, it's barely recognizable. I'm surprised that the Sweden Democrats and the AFS don't have more votes than they actually do. But it's going to take time before anything changes. The question is, does Sweden have time? Can Sweden endure another term of leftist liberal policies? These policies have been destroying the country for decades. How much longer can Sweden survive? Time is running out. It's quite a serious matter. Unless you want to see Sweden turn into a caliphate, it is time to act. When you just look a little bit at the mainstream news, you think that everything is fine. Yeah, maybe there are some little problems here or there, but in general, Sweden is going in the right direction. The biggest threat, according to the mainstream media, is the so-called the far-right extremists who are against immigration, who are against Muslims. But when you take a look at the alternative media, which is the only place that you can actually find the real news, you'll see that things are not so great in Sweden. Just a quick look at the news in the last few days in Sweden. Here's an article that says that a female politician from the Sweden Democrats was shot at. She is a parliamentarian for the Sweden Democrats, and while she was driving, she was shot at. In an interview, she said that she thought that she was going to die. I would not be that surprised if this was happening in, for example, Sudan or maybe Somalia, but in Sweden, this is quite a story. The country used to be a very calm place. Not much happened. And today you have parliamentarians being shot at. Now, of course, I don't think it's a coincidence that this happens, that this shooting occurred against a politician from the SD party. The Sweden Democrats and the Alternative for Sweden are parties which are not liked by the establishment. So it's no surprise that this shooting just happened to occur. We might see more of these types of shootings in the future. Here's another story. In Malmö, a city which has become very famous for all the wrong reasons, unfortunately, there was a 31-year-old man who went around in central Malmö with a Kalashnikov, fully loaded. But as I read in this article, the charges against him have been dropped. Well, what do you know? Malmö is getting a bit dangerous these days. Recently, there were dozens of cars set on fire in several Swedish cities. These attacks look like they were organized, and the police had trouble or they didn't want to arrest anybody. The day after these attacks occurred, there was another attack in Uppsala where more cars were set on fire. It's nothing unusual that cars are set on fire in Sweden. This happens all the time, but these particular attacks were very widespread and very large in their extent. Here's another story. Sweden sets a new world record. The number of deliberate school fires has gone up by 47%, from 292 cases in 2015 to 429 cases in 2017. This is a world record. Here's another interesting story. The taxes has to be raised when the Swedish population is going to increase by an estimated 800,000 people. This is quite interesting. Normally, when the population grows, that should be something positive for the economy. More people can work and so on, but not in Sweden. It's estimated that the taxes, which are already one of the world's highest, will have to be raised even more when as it says in this article, the population is going to grow by 800,000. This number refers to migrants, of course. The Swedish indigenous population is basically stable. It doesn't really increase that much. Most of this increase comes from migration. And it's no surprise because in spite of what the mainstream media says, A lot of migrants cannot find work. Most of them are unemployed, at least during the first years. Even after 7 or 10 years, a lot of migrants do in fact have a very difficult time finding work. That means they are a burden to the Swedish taxpayer. They do not contribute to society. Society has to take care of them, has to provide for housing, healthcare, schooling, and so on. And once more, it's Malmö in the news again. During the Malmö Festivalen, there were reports of sexual attacks on girls under 15 by grown men. This is no surprise at all. This is just the everyday reality in Sweden these days. Here's another article. No surprise, it's about Malmö. A nightclub was shot several times. Fortunately, no one got hurt. It's just that the facade of the nightclub was damaged due to the shots fired. So, in other words, just another night in Malmö. In this article, it says that a 22-year-old Afghani who is just about to get deported from Sweden raped a woman. He said that this was his last day in Sweden and he wanted to have fun. Yep, there's nothing like raping women just before you're going to leave a country. Migrants are certainly taking full advantage of the Swedish hospitality. It's stories like this that is making Sweden extremely unsafe. The country has changed so much during the last decade and especially during the last couple of years. A person who lived in Sweden 30 years ago and would go back to that country today would probably not recognize it. And the problem is that Sweden is continuing down this vicious path. I fear that things are going to become worse before they become better. The political landscape in Sweden is getting increasingly aggressive. Before, like 30 or 40 years ago, politicians used to treat each other with respect, even if they didn't agree with one another. Today, that's not the case. For example, here's one article about the Social Democrats spreading lies about the Sweden Democrats and the Moderate Party in Arabic. Apparently, the Social Democrats were spreading these lies on a page on Facebook, and they wrote in Arabic that these two parties, the Sweden Democrats and the Moderates, are racist parties which recently have begun to flourish, and they are a great risk to all of us. As I mentioned before, there was the shooting of a parliamentarian from the Sweden Democrats, and you can really feel the leftist propaganda in the Swedish elections. For example, in this article, we see that in Härryda kommun, the local politicians decided that pride flags should be put back into the voting station. According to the politicians, they want to elevate different forms of alternative sexual lifestyles. Yeah, because that is so important during elections. In the Swedish news channel TV4, there was a joke made by some satire comics about the Sweden Democrats, that they are so great at transporting people by train. They are implying, of course, that the Sweden Democrats are like the Nazis. They want to transport foreigners to concentration camps. And there are many, many other examples. And yet, in spite of all of this massive propaganda against the SD and AFS, turns out that the Sweden Democrats could quite possibly become the largest party. So you can really see that the Swedish people are starting to wake up. On September the 9th, we will see how the Swedish people vote. We will see if they are ready for change.